Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. We have another online event by Agora Energiewende. It's the 15th or 14th, I believe, already, since we started at the beginning of April. And today's topic is the role of state aid in the EU's green recovery. Now, who do you see on the podium? We have Matthias book. Now, hang on, let me explain who Agora Energiewende is, because many of you may know it. It's an independent think tank funded by two private foundations. And we are around 45 to 50 colleagues, mainly working from Berlin, but some are also working from China, Brussels, and some other cities. I don't know what's wrong today with me. I'm constantly knotting my tongue, sorry for that. So, who do you see on the podium? There is Matthias Buck, who is Head of European Energy Policy at Agora Energiewende. Juliette Delarue is a lawyer at Client Earth, which is a charity that uses the power of law to protect people and planet. And we have Clemens Holtmann, who's a lawyer at the law firm Redeker. You do not see Andreas Graf, but he's also there. He's project manager EU Energy Policy at Agora Energiewende, and you will see him later on during the webinar. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm the head of events at Agora Energiewende. During the next around 1 hour, we will first have a presentation by Matthias, Juliette, and Clemens, which will last for some 35 minutes. We then have time, around 15 minutes, for a Q&A session, which will be moderated by Andreas. And then it should be noon. In case we have many questions that we cannot address during this hour or during the official Q&A session, we may extend for another 5 to 10 minutes. We will see towards the end. Everyone on the panel did say he or she has the time to extend a bit. So we'll see what's going to happen during the course of the webinar. We are currently looking at some 90 persons. So let me see. How we cannot see you, so that's always a pity. So how can you get in contact with us? You have two options. Some of you may already know how it works. At the bottom of your screen, you see a chat window or a chat button and a Q&A or F&A button. Please do use the chat button only for your technical remarks or questions. For instance, if you cannot hear us or if the video is frozen or something, put that into the chat window. We will use the chat window to inform you about relevant links and email addresses and what have you. The other participants cannot see what you put into the chat. More important, maybe the Q&A button, which is for your content-related questions. So whatever comes up to your mind during the presentation, put that in there. This will also remain invisible for the rest of the audience until Andreas picks it and takes it into the Q&A session. Then it becomes visible for the rest of the audience, so we all know which questions we were able to address. And then last but not least, you see on the top left that we are recording this online event because we want to make it available for anyone who cannot join right now. It will be on the website at some stage later this week. And now, before I hand over to Matthias, Juliette, and Clemens, we try to get to know you at least a little better. And we have prepared a poll for you, and I will open it so you can answer it. I will start it and I will read it out to you so people who cannot see it if they are not using the app. I will read it out. So, what sector do you work for is the first question. And we have answer A, EU public authority, B, national public authority, C, private sector, D, science, E, NGO, and F for others. And then the second question is, what is your field of work? Is it A, state aid, B, climate and energy, C, both, or D, other? And I still see people typing in their answers. So I will give it Looks like everyone has typed in the answer. 3 more seconds, and then I can show you the results. Okay. So now you should be able to see it on your screen. We have a vast majority from the private sector with 48%, which means 30 persons actually, followed then by 21% from other sectors, 15% from national public authorities, 10% from science, 6% from NGOs, which means 4 persons, and no one from EU public authorities. Interesting. The field of work is 76%, so 47% climate and energy. And then followed by dealing with both, 16%, 3% work in state aid, and 5%, which is 3 persons, in other fields. Now, with this image of you as the audience, I hand over to Matthias and make sure that the poll disappears from your screen. There you go.
Thank you, Nicola, and welcome to all of you that are listening in and participating in today's webinar. Very warm welcome from Berlin. And specifically, I want to thank the European Climate Foundation for the short-term funding they have given for this specific piece of work, given that we were looking for someone to support this in the developing broader discussion on Europe's green recovery. So it was kind of adding on to the work of Agora, adding on to the work of Client Earth. Unfortunately, we found Redica law firm to support us in this project, now generously funded by the European Climate Foundation. Next slide, please. So this is the order of speakers today in the order of their appearance, not in the order of their importance. And so Nicola introduced us. I will take the first introductory slides, then Juliette will go a bit deeper into why is state aid relevant, what's the role of state aid potentially, and then Clemens Holtmann from Redica will present the legal analysis that is underpinning the main messages that we, Agora, Energiewende, and Client Earth are drawing for, let's say, the future of state aid considerations in the field of climate and energy policy. Next slide, please. So what is the background of this report? We are all aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has led governments to essentially lock down the economies by keeping citizens at home. Sorry, I need to just, I have a problem with, I cannot see my slides. Okay, I need to, sorry. Give me a second. Andreas, I cannot see your screen for some reason. Okay, now it works. Okay, sorry for that. I couldn't see the slides myself because my speaking window was covering it. So we are still in an economic crisis. According to the International Monetary Fund, it could be the worst recession since the Great Depression in the 1930s. What is particular about this economic crisis that we are seeing a simultaneous supply and demand shock. On the one hand side, consumers are simply consuming less because people stay at home in order to keep social distancing measures. And on the other hand side, because people stay at home, many of the companies, services can simply not operate. And so we're also seeing a dramatic decline in production. So both of this is adding up to a forecasted drop of annual GDP in Europe in 2020 by around 7.5%. There are some concerns that if the member states don't swiftly adopt the future budget of Europe, which is explicitly a recovery budget, then the recession could be even worse. Next slide, please. Now, why does the recovery need to be green? It is very simple. If you're looking at some of the technology lifetimes, which are part of the picture of the economic recovery measures governments are handing out money for through the national stimulus programs, you see that the economic lifetime of those technologies reaches, in some cases, up to 2030, where it's a very important point for our European climate targets, but even beyond or up to 2050, which is the date when Europe as a continent seeks to be climate neutral, according to the decision of EU heads of state in December last year. Now, the simple message is that the investments now initiated, including through national stimulus programs, will have an impact on the climate that could reach until 2030, 2040, 2050, or even beyond. Now, given the limited fiscal space that exists, the time constraints, and also economic efficiency, it is crystal clear that you cannot postpone tackling the climate crisis and just focusing on tackling the economic crisis from the coronavirus lockdown measures now. You need to do both at the same time. You need to design your stimulus programs in a way that there's a dual stimulus, both helping the economic recovery, but also accelerating the transition to climate neutrality. Next slide, please. Now, what is the role of state aid in pushing for a green recovery? And will state aid help Europe to recover better in the sense of not only economically recovering, but also fast forwarding climate protection in Europe? There is a political agreement that the stimulus measures should also support the Green Deal and achievement of Europe's climate targets. But there are differing views also in the Commission leadership on the role of state aid in pushing for Green Deal consistent stimulus programs. And for this reason, we felt it is appropriate to take a hard look at what could the role of state aid be in pushing for Europe's green recovery. And the main messages from the report that we will publish in a few days is that first message, the treaties do empower and oblige the Commission to address environmental of non-state measures. So also if a government decides to build a road, this of course has some indirect environmental effects. This is also something the Commission would be obliged to address. The Commission would indeed, according to the analysis, violate its duties under the treaty when it's approving state aid measures without any consideration to whether these are consistent with EU climate laws and objectives. And one of the conclusions from our report is that the Commission should inform the member states how it will in the future assess the Green Deal consistency of national stimulus programs. Next slide, please. So we are doing a poll here. Nicola, do you want to introduce the poll?
Yes, I will. And you should be able to see it on your screen now. The question is, can the Commission use its competence in state aid to green member states' recovery packages? 3 possible answers. A, yes, it has legal competence for doing so. B, it has some political powers, but no legal competence for doing so. C, the Commission should not interfere with national recovery measures. And people are voting. You cannot see it yet. That's the big advantage of the host. So, looks like you've made a decision, and I will finish the poll and make it available for you. And as you can all see, Matthias, maybe you want to comment on that?
Yes, this is also my experience that people do believe that the Commission should play a role, but they are unclear about the legal competence. We just had questions recently from the European Parliament, for instance, that was working on a resolution how far the Commission legally could go in pushing for greening. And so this is good news for us as a team working on these aspects, because it means that our report comes at the right time and could help to inform about the critical issue. Juliette, I'm handing over to you now.
Thank you. So as Matthias mentioned, our study, our report is focusing on the role of state aid in the recovery, and how much could the Commission push a green recovery through stated rules and stated guidance. So just a small definition for those who are not familiar with the subject. State aid are generally seen as an advantage in any form. So it can be, tax reductions, direct grants, loan guarantees, conferred by public authorities, by national member states, on a selective basis to undertakings. Undertakings, they are businesses, they're companies, enterprises of whatever size, whatever corporate form, it doesn't matter. So in this respect, state aid are regulated by EU law, completely by EU law. National law doesn't have a role to play in this. State aid are in principle prohibited in the EU. For those of you who are familiar with this topic, you know that statistically state aid are more often allowed than not, especially in the energy sector, which is the sector we are working the most on. But this is the principle that member states should notify the state aid to the Commission. The Commission should authorize them before the aid is being paid, unless you have obviously exceptions where the member state can grant the aid directly if they're filling a certain amount of conditions, which are called like exempted aid. And so because you have this powerful control by the European Commission, by the EU, on whether member states can give state aid, can give advantages to certain companies, certain sectors of the economy, it's a very powerful tool. And we argue that it's also a very strong policy tool on how to enable or to slow down certain investments. Because obviously member states are free to design state aid measures as they wish. There's no obligation on member state to give any aid to any company. It's really member states' choice, but they need to do so in a certain framework under certain conditions. And the way these conditions are set up by the European Commission obviously are going to enable or to block the investments and to drive them in a certain direction. Some examples that you might have seen in the context of COVID recently, there was a lot of state aid being paid by member states to alleviate the consequences of the crisis, especially for all companies and the sectors, especially SMEs. But we also see state aid having a great role to play in the, let's say, post-crisis, or at least post-immediate crisis recovery, because it's time to rescue companies, but it's also time to make sure that there's a fuel for the new investments. And for example, airline bailouts, you've seen that many airlines, Lufthansa a couple of days ago, Air France a month ago, TAP and others in the EU have received big packages from the national governments. But we also expect and argue that there should be investments into technologies such as energy efficiency investments in buildings should be improved. Production of green hydrogen should be also one of the takers of the recovery. Modernizing some production sites. All these investments are going to involve state aid to some extent. And as you see in the next slide, the Commission already during the crisis has been adopting some specific rules under a temporary framework to enable member states to quickly inject liquidity into the economy. The framework has been revised already 3 times, again yesterday, to play on different levels of aid. But the importance to remember in this framework, which is already in place and used by the member state quite extensively, is that the Commission did not impose any particular conditions for the investments or for the aid to be paid. What I mean there is that there's no, in this framework, there's no like green condition in the sense where the member states are free to give aid to any company of any sector, regardless of the impact on the climate targets and environmental impacts. except in the amendment of 8 May, where the Commission said that if member states are going to recapitalize large enterprises, those enterprises should have in place a plan and justify on how they are going to use the aid in the pathway to the net zero targets by 2050, and how they're going to use the aid in line with the Green Deal. So that's what has been said. For the rest, there's no specific condition imposed by the Commission to date, and it's really left up for the member states to decide whether they are going to impose such conditions. One example we can quote, it might not be the prominent one, but has been quite mediatic, is that France, for example, gave state aid to Air France, the airline, under the condition that they invest in cleaner fuels, that they are reducing their greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 to a certain extent. So that's one example of the condition. What we are looking at in this report and in this analysis is that we also believe that the Commission can go further and should go further in the context of the recovery. You know, there's a EU budget on the table, which is being discussed by member states and the Parliament, and will probably be adopted by the end of the summer. There would be EU money, there would be money on the table that would be spent by member states and might translate into state aid programs. And these stimulus programs should be aligned, according to us, also with the pursuit of the objectives of the Paris Agreement, of the European climate and energy targets, because it's a pathway we cannot avoid. And so the consequence of that is that the Commission should be updating its state aid framework, not only the temporary framework for COVID, as I mentioned, but more globally, take into account that public investments and the state aid going to support them should be aligned with the Green Deal. Why is that so? Because the Green Deal has been on the table, you know, before the COVID in January already, and is supposed to be the main policy driver for Commission's and the EU's action in the future. And so we argue that state aid should not be left alone, and it's very much part of the Green Deal. That state aid decisions and rules should be mainstreamed in line with this Green Deal. And as you see on the next slide as well, we demonstrate in this report we are preparing that the Commission should now clarify and should first assess and clarify how it will assess in the future the environmental impact of the project and activities which are supported by state aid. Clemens will detail a bit later on the legal reasoning behind it, but we believe it's now time that the Commission seeks evidence that environmental law is complied with the project which is supported. For now, you see many instances where the Commission is approving state aid, but is not doing, you know, an environmental law assessment because that's not the role of DG Competition or traditionally. But that's very much part of taking into account environmental protection requirements. So at least the Commission should be doing, should check that there's such assessment. But also the Commission should also make sort of environmental impact or greenhouse gas emissions impact of the project or activity which is going to be supported by state aid. Why? Because now member states are supporting activities and projects which are, you know, not in line or clearly contradicting the Green Deal at present, and the pathway towards net zero by 2050, which has been set at EU level. And we need to ensure consistency between state aid measures, what member states are financing, what is compatible now with the internal market should also be aligned with the objectives of the Green Deal. And it's a matter of consistency and it's a matter of legal duty of the Commission. And for this reason, the Commission should ideally seek evidence from the member state, from the beneficiary of the aid, that there's some environmental impact assessment has been made, that the environmental impacts of the project have been assessed, and when those projects are definitely going to increase greenhouse gas emissions, which can be projected, the beneficiary should have in place, you know, business plan and report on it, make it transparent and enforceable, in order to align their activities with the different climate targets. So, as I said, we believe that the treaties of the EU, especially Article 11 of the treaty, not only allows this assessment to be made by the Commission, but that it should be used and clearly enforced in the context of the recovery packages and beyond across all sectors. And the revision of the guidelines expected next year would be a great opportunity for the Commission to take into account those principles. Thank you. And I leave it to Clemens to detail the legal reasoning on this part.
Clemens, are you muted?
Clemens, you're muted.
Right. Does it work? I think it works.
No.
No?
Yes.
Yeah, it does. Okay. Thank you very much. So my task now will be to make you familiar with the legal arguments that are based behind the recommendations already explained by Juliette. And in the first part, I would like to explain to you to what extent environmental protection is already included or anchored as a cross-sectional task in EU law. When it comes to the different levels of EU law. And so when it comes to the EU treaties, we have to state that initially the European primary
Andreas, can
law,
you switch the slides? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, thank you very much. So initially, the treaties focus very much on economic policy and social policy as community objectives. And only in 1997, there was a change also with respect to environmental protection, because then with the Treaty of Amsterdam, a cross-cutting environmental integration clause was integrated in the treaties. Now in Article 11 TFEU, which was already mentioned by Juliette, at that time it was Article 6 of the EC treaty. And maybe I just once read this provision this rule, because it's very crucial for our legal argumentation. It says, environmental protection requirements must be integrated into the definition and implementation of the Union's policies and activities, in particular with a view to promoting sustainable development. So this clause leads to an objective obligation of the EU institutions to integrate environmental protection requirements into the definition and implementation of all EU policies and activities, also others than environmental policies or activities. So it also extends to the application and the definition of competition law, which is laid down in Article 3 of the treaty. And it derives from this indirectly also an obligation on the member states to integrate environmental aspects into the design of national measures, because Article 4, Para 3 of the EU Treaty establishes the so-called duty of cooperation of the member states, which says that the member states shall facilitate the achievement of the Union's tasks and refrain from any measure which could jeopardize the attainment of the Union's objectives. So Article 4 lays down an obligation on the member states to bear in mind EU policy objectives, so also environmental ones, when designing or taking measures at the national level. When it comes to the EU secondary law, of course, there is a lot of legislation taking note of environmental objectives. You all know the Climate and Energy Package 2020, the Framework for Climate and Energy Policy 2030. These packages are a sort of combination of multi-sector climate laws with also sectoral legislation. And nowadays, the Green Deal, is the high topical issue at EU level, was published by the Commission in December 2019. And in its roadmap, the Green Deal includes also the proposal on a European climate law, which shall enshrine the climate neutrality target for 2050. And the Commission published its proposal back in March this year. And this climate neutrality target and the Green Deal were also endorsed by the EU heads of state during their council meeting in December last year. And there is also overwhelming scientific evidence that rapid greenhouse gas emission reductions from today to 2050 are needed to avoid a climate crisis with catastrophic consequences for the whole planet. Next slide, please. As we said today, our focus will be state aid law. So to what extent environmental protection was incorporated as a cross-sectoral task also in state aid law? One can say that initially state aid law back in the 60s, it was purely industry oriented and focused very much on the coal and steel sectors. This has changed mainly since 1994 when the Commission adopted for the first time environmental protection state aid guidelines. And the 2001 version of these guidelines called for an integration of environmental policy into other state aid guidelines. So also sectoral state aid guidelines, touching on other state aid measures others than environmental aid. However, we have to state, unfortunately, that there's only very little progress in that respect. But at least we can say that the Commission recognized the importance of environmental protection as a key objective of state aid policy, especially in times of crisis. Already back in the financial crisis 2009, but also today when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis. For example, in its recently published biodiversity strategy for 2030, the Commission says, when starting the economy now to come out of the crisis, it is crucial to avoid falling back and locking ourselves into damaging old habits. The European Green Deal will be the compass for our recovery. And as Juliette already mentioned, also in one amendment from, I think, 8th of May of the temporary state aid framework to deal with the COVID crisis, there is also a clause saying that large undertakings, which are recapitalized by state aid measures, must report on how the aid received supports their activities in line with the EU objectives and national obligations linked to the Green Deal or to the green transformation, including the 2050 neutrality objective. Moreover, the Commission is committed to update its current environmental and energy state aid rules, you know, the current EEAG, which normally should end of this year, were prolonged by the Commission. And there will be a public consultation in the first half of next year on the revision of these environmental and energy state aid guidelines, and the next version shall normally be adopted in the second half of next year. But as Juliette already mentioned, for the time being, the temporary framework, which is now the main basis for the Commission to grant recovery aid to come out of this COVID crisis, does not make recovery aid conditional on environmental conditions or aims. However, it is true that the Commission is entitled and is even under an obligation to consider environmental protection objectives also when assessing recovery aid. And this is due to the following reasons, which I will point out in the following. Next slide, please. First of all, when it comes to environmental mainstreaming into recovery aid control or state aid control in general, one has to bear in mind one general legal standard, which is regularly repeated by the Court of Justice, but which so far is not written down in state aid rules. But the Court of Justice has established the following standard: state aid, certain conditions of which contravene other provisions of the treaty, cannot be compatible with the common market. So when a member state grants state aid or the Commission has to assess national measures, it has to bear in mind, has to take consideration also of all other provisions of the treaty, including Article 11, which is the so-called cross-cutting environmental integration clause, which I've already mentioned. Advocate General Geelhout from the Court of Justice has stated that Article 6, EC Treaty at that time, now Article 11, is to be regarded as an obligation on the part of the community institutions to take account of ecological interests, also in policy areas outside that of environmental protection in stricto sensu. So this obligation also extends to other areas than purely environmental ones, so also to state aid law and application of state aid law. This is because Article 11 refers to all unions' policies and activities, so also to competition law as a whole. And against or besides this, the Commission has to take into account when it is assessing state aid measures its own self-commitments. For example, the Paris Agreement that the EU has undersigned, the 2030 and 2050 targets, its own proposal on an EU climate law, the Green Deal. All this has to be taken into account by the Commission, because otherwise it would infringe Article 11 and also the so-called consistency clause of the treaty, which is laid down in Article 7 of the EC Treaty, EU Treaty, which says, the Union shall ensure consistency between its policies and activities, taking all of its objectives into account. So when dealing with state aid, the Commission cannot leave aside its environmental policy objectives to which it is committed. At the same degree, as I already told, the member states are bound by the so-called duty of cooperation. So also the member states under Article 4 of the EU Treaty have to bear in mind the EU environmental objectives when designing state aid measures. So this is the general legal standard that when member states design and the Commission assesses state aid measures, they have to take into account other provisions of the treaties. Next slide, please. However, one can state that in its usual decision-making practice, the Commission normally does not care so much about this general unwritten principle, which I just have explained to you, but it sticks very much to the traditional assessment scheme laid down in the several legal bases for the compatibility of state aid measures. And when it comes to relief or recovery aid, the most important provisions are Article 7, Para 3, B and C of the TFEU. Let's first have a look at Article 107, Para 3b, which is also the legal basis of the temporary state aid framework in the context of the COVID crisis. This provision refers to aid to remedy a serious disturbance in the economy of a member state. And in the context of the COVID crisis, the Commission has acknowledged that all economies in all member states are in a serious disturbance. So Article 3b applies to all member states measures in this COVID crisis. And the temporary framework, which is based, as I said, on Article 107 3b, lays down compatibility criteria for certain aid measures, for example, recapitalization, direct grants, guarantees, and different other measures. But member states have also the possibility to grant measures which are not covered by the temporary framework, but they can base other measures directly on Article 107 3b. And the aim of this provision is the support of economic growth in the sense of a sustainable long-term growth of the economy. This is also stressed in the temporary state aid framework. This is because nowadays medium and long-term economic growth is not longer any possible without environmental protection. We have we are in a so-called climate emergency. And also the Commission has acknowledged that in times of crisis, there's a concrete danger that environmental achievements may be reversed and environmental objectives postponed. We have a need of close European coordination to combat this crisis while at the same time bearing in mind our environmental objectives. So environmental protection must be a key objective of state aid control under the temporary framework or when member states grant measures directly based on Article 107.3b. Next slide, please. In its temporary framework, which is based, as I said, on 107.3b, the Commission explicitly states that the member states can, however, continue to apply the most common legal basis for state aid, which is Article 107.3c TFEU, which refers to aid to facilitate the development of certain economic activities or of certain economic areas where such aid does not adversely affect trading conditions to an extent contrary to the common interest. And if you want, the assessment under Article 103c is substantially about a balancing of positive effects of an aid measure on objectives of common interest, for example, employment, economic growth, regional cohesion, or whatever. So to balance these positive effects of the aid measure against its adverse effects on competition and economic growth, or as the Commission has stated in the past, sometimes on sustainable economic growth. And we see that there is a lot of scope for the Commission when conducting an assessment on the basis of Article 107.3c to take into account environmental aspects and on the positive side of its balancing and of the negative side of the balancing. When it comes to the positive side, it has to be borne in mind that the positive impetus for the common interest pursued by the member state with its aid measure, for example, employment, growth, regional cohesion, security of energy apply, that this common interest can be neutralized by very harmful effects on the environment. So that finally, after all, you don't have any positive aspect anymore. If you have positive impact on employment, but very harmful effects on environment, at the end, they neutralize, and then you don't pursue, at the end, no overwhelming positive common interest anymore. This is particularly relevant for aid other than environmental aid to projects which involve by nature greenhouse gas emissions. For example, when it comes to coal-fired power stations or some kind of aviation, maybe with the opposite example of the Air France aid, which Juliette has already mentioned, but also when it comes to vehicles with traditional combustion engines. But also on the negative side of the balancing test, Article 11 has to be taken into account by the Commission. Because climate change has a significant negative impact on the economy. This is now also underlined by scientific evidence that environment harmful measures harm also our economic growth opportunities. So the Commission has to verify if the adverse effect on a sustainable economic development outweigh the positive impetus for the pursued common interests. If this is the case, state aid cannot be approved by the Commission. Next slide, please. So, having said all this, we believe that the Commission can take into account environmental assessments, considerations, and requirements in its discretion within its authority on state aid decision making. For example, the Commission may verify whether a funded project or activity complies with the beneficiary's EU environmental legal obligations, and of course also national law which implements EU environmental law. So this is a minimum criterion. If the measure itself, which is funded by state aid, violates the beneficiary's EU environmental law obligations, of course, aid for such a project cannot be approved. With regard to project activities which do not directly violate EU law, but which involve by nature substantial greenhouse gas emissions, the Commission shall verify that the measure is nevertheless a step in the right direction to achieve the EU's climate and energy targets. For example, as Juliette already said, by seeking an environmental impact report of the project. Then the Commission may also require a member state to demonstrate that there is no less environmentally harmful alternative to the project funded by state aid, or if there is an alternative, why this is not used. After all, the criteria which I have explained just before would in general or in principle lead to the rejection of aid for fossil fuel projects and activities, because in view of the imminent exhaustion of the global carbon budget, the phasing out must now be definite. Otherwise, we just cannot cope with the EU environmental objectives. Especially where aid is granted to an installation or infrastructure with a very long lifetime, for example, beyond 2030 and 2050, which are the crucial target timelines of EU environmental policy, the Commission shall require a plan of appropriate environmental safeguard measures. For example, it could ask the member state to make the grant of aid conditional on energy efficiency measures of the beneficiary of the aid. And moreover, the Commission may also consider if the member state concerned is on track or not to meet its 2030 targets. Thank you very much so far.
So, thank you, Clemens. Thank you, Juliette. Just very briefly, as you've seen, legal discussions are always a bit technical, but the conclusions from those legal arguments are practically quite important. We do know that state aid will play an important role in the successful economic recovery and reform. And as I argued at the very beginning, it is important that the national stimulus programs also pursue and help the transition to greenhouse gas neutrality in Europe. Now, but in a nutshell, the legal analysis is showing that indeed the Commission is empowered under the treaties and obliged to systematically assess and address environmental effects of non-environmental state aid measures which are being planned. And this goes in particular for measures that would directly or indirectly result in a substantive increase of greenhouse gas emissions, and thus raise questions on how such stimulus programs would fit into the pursuit of the EU and national objectives of reaching climate neutrality by 2050 or achieving the 2030 climate targets. Now, we would argue, and the analysis by Redica is showing it, that it would indeed violate the duties of the Commission under the treaties when it approves state aid without giving consideration to these issues in its state aid assessment. Now, against this background, we recommend that it is high time that the Commission soon informs the member states how it will address those issues in the future to assess the climate policy consistency of national stimulus programs. Now, this would be my conclusions, and I'm looking forward, as are doing Juliette and Clemens, to the discussion with you. We have another poll before we go to the discussion.
Shall we? We were thinking to just do the same one as we had before to see if opinions have changed in the meantime, right?
Yes.
So I will just show you the results we had before. 49% thinking it has some political powers but no legal competence for doing so, the Commission. And 48% thinking yes, it has legal competence for doing so. And 3% the Commission should not interfere with national recovery measures. And I will start it once more. And you can vote again. Okay, anyone else? 3 more seconds. Make up your mind. Okay, I will finish it now. And it's an interesting result. Because it's changed, and we have a majority of thinking that the Commission does have legal competence for using its competence in state aid to green member states' recovery packages. Only 16% think now it has some political powers, but no legal competence for doing so. And still 4% the Commission should not interfere with national recovery measures. And with that, Andreas, I think we start with a Q&A session. And I will finish the presentation, right? Because I don't think, or do you need it? Do you need to?
No, we will switch over. Thank you, Nicola. And now we will go over to the Q&A session. We're close to the end of the originally foreseen time. We have quite a few interesting questions though. So please submit your questions. We might go a little bit over time. We ask you to bear with us, but we do want some of these interesting questions answered. And I will start with actually the first question that was asked, actually kind of at the very beginning of the presentation, but nonetheless, I think a natural question if one accepts the legal analysis. And so first to Matthias, if this is true, and we have this legal analysis showing us that the Commission has this power, or at least is empowered to make use of the treaties to make sure that environmental law is made consistent with competition law and vice versa, then how is it that in the past we have had countries perhaps disregard climate relevant criteria in designing state aid, and the Commission not taking it as seriously as perhaps the treaties suggest?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think it's a very fair question. Why is this in the treaties, as Clemens was highlighting, since 1997, and it has not been applied to the extent that is possible? Now, I think what is different today from 1997, in 1997, climate change science, of course, was indicating there's a problem. But the situation has changed. Today, we know that if we do not, within the next decades, do everything we can to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that we are facing a very serious situation as a species. Now, so the relevance of the environment integration principle in the treaties has become factually much more prominent. And so this is, I believe, the main reason why something that has been in the treaties for quite some time is now becoming much more relevant in the practical decision-making practice of the Commission in the future. And then the second point is the political balancing exercise. Clemens was highlighting, and this that there is discretion by the Commission on how it is exercising its state aid competence. Now, discretion always takes into account the political context, whereas climate policy was much less politically relevant in the past. It is now becoming a political priority across the board. And indeed, the Green Deal adoption and support by EU heads of state is showing that it is really at the center of decision making in the next years, politically speaking. So also from that perspective, in its exercising its discretion, the Commission is now much more in a situation where it can use its competence under the treaties and exercise its discretion to a stronger integration of environmental and climate policy objectives also in state aid decision making. Now, this does not say that to the question, the German stimulus package is inconsistent with environmental objectives. As we are saying, it needs to be addressed measure by measure. If you look at the German stimulus package, there's a broad range of measures which are indeed explicitly pursuing climate objectives. And there are some measures where you can have second thoughts. And particularly for these measures, we are arguing that the Commission should be exercising more of its state aid scrutiny also to push for environmental objectives.
Thank you, Matthias. And now I have two more legal questions or implementation questions, one could say. And the first I will give to Juliette, and it is written in German, but I think, so I will read it in English, so to say. And the question is essentially, in implementing this consistency criteria, would it make more sense to draft new guidelines that are cross-sectoral, or to include climate criteria in individual sectoral guidelines?
I don't think it makes much difference legally. Obviously, if you've got a general principle in guidelines or in the framework that applies across all economic sectors, you do clarify that it's a consistent principle that should be systematically applied by the Commission. And it makes it obviously easier as a reference. For example, you've got currently a communication on the notion of state aid that applies to any state aid, any framework. And you could as well have, communication that applies cross-sectorially. So that's, that would be definitely easier. It doesn't prevent from repeating this principle into specific guidelines later on. From procedural point of view, the process is the same. The Commission adopts the guidelines and apply them systematically and is bound by them. So again, it doesn't make a pure legal difference, but that would be from the political message and the reference would be easier in the cross-cutting guidelines. The cross-cutting principle will be systematically replicated into each set of guidelines, because again, they are not guidelines for everything. So you also need to be aware, we are speaking often of the guidelines for environmental protection and energy, or for airports, transport, but they are not guidelines for every sector of the economy, far from it. So that would be helpful to have indeed a cross-cutting rule. And just quickly, because I saw another question also from Marcus that I replied quickly in the chat. He asked whether the treaties could be potentially changed to integrate environmental protection principle into Article 107 that deals with state aid. As Matthias just explained, we don't think it's currently necessary because the principles have been there, Article 7, Article 11 that we mentioned, that indeed provide that environmental protection should be taken into account into every union's policy. Competition law, state aid is a union policy and competence. So we don't believe it's necessary to change the treaties for implementing these principles.
Thank you. And I would read another question and then also direct this to you and also give you an opportunity to add anything you might want to add, Clemens. But the question would be, if it is necessary to have an environmental assessment for approval of state aid, who would be the natural person to perform the assessment, and would this be the commissioner or project owner? And if you want to make any additions to the legal argumentation of Juliette just now.
Yeah. I mean, the natural person to do this assessment, of course, would be the Commission, because the Commission is the single state aid supervisor authority in the European Union. But of course, it would be helpful would be very helpful also for the Commission if the member states themselves already consider environmental objectives when designing their state aid measures, which was also stressed by Vice President Vestager, I think, in a hearing in the European Parliament. She welcomed very much France's approach when they granted state aid to Air France, which was conditional on some environmental aspects. But in that case, it was already the French government who included these environmental conditions in the state aid design. But if the member states notify measures which do not sufficiently consider environmental objectives, then it would be up to the Commission to demand the member state to improve its measure, to make, that's what we said, mainstreaming into state aid assessment, environmental mainstreaming into state aid assessment. And this is the aim of our report and of our legal analysis, to demonstrate that the Commission is entitled by law, by primary law, by the treaties to do so.
And perhaps if I may add, I think as Clemens is saying, it is not either or, but it's a shared responsibility. This also follows from the treaty, where you have the duty of cooperation of member states to help the Commission pursue the state aid objectives and the environment objectives of the treaties. And of course, it would be very helpful if the Commission were to clarify ASAP how a member state would be asked to articulate the greenhouse, or let's say the climate policy consistency of specific aid packages that do have result in greenhouse gas emissions, how it would articulate that in its notification sent to Brussels on the planned state aid. This would kind of save time for the member states and for the Commission, and leave us all in a better place. So I see it very much as Clemens, as a shared responsibility.
And if I may just add on a practical aspect, because also I think the question was referring to at the end of the day, who should make these environmental assessments when there's one to be made. It's all, I mean, very clearly, it's not for the Commission itself to calculate, you know, the greenhouse gas emissions of the project. It's generally very much for the member state to justify why they're granting state aid, what is the documentation supporting the grant of the aid, how is the company, you know, what company is going to receive the aid, and so on. And so documentation on this respect should also come from, as mentioned in the question, from project owners and from the member states to be documented and sent to the Commission, so the Commission can make these assessments. So we mentioned cooperation. There's also cooperation with the beneficiary in case it's an individual aid to an easily identifiable company. Otherwise, it would be very much for the member state to prove evidence and to collect this information from the project owners in order to help the Commission to make this assessment.
Thank you, Juliette. And I will take two more questions. The first being, I would say for Matthias, is there anything that should be changed in the current proposals for the recovery program at EU level? Let's start with the proposal of the Commission for the EU budget and the recovery fund that could help reinforce this environmental control of the Commission of state aid.
Although, I mean, those are two distinct things. One is the budget. So, and there's currently the negotiation on what the EU budget should be spent for. We will be coming out in a few days with an in-depth analysis on how green is the budget and how there could be additional safeguards in the future budget, going really funding line by funding line, and also suggesting a few things like increasing the climate share and taking some safeguards to avoid harmful spending from the budget. But this is programming how public funding will be used. Why is state aid relevant? Because the EU budget is only a tiny part of public spending for economic recovery. The EU budget compared to national budgets is a small one. And so it's like 1% of EU GDP. And so the national spending is very relevant, and the national spending needs to be state aid consistent if it is giving selective advantages to market participants. And for that reason, state aid must play a very important complementary role to a future EU budget that we all hope will be much greener than the existing one. So in that sense, it is not about integrating state aid into the budget, but about having those two important pieces of the picture complementary. And of course, there will be, let's say, a shared reference points. Shared reference points being, for example, the energy lending guidelines of the European Investment Bank adopted last year, which exclude public financing of fossil projects with very few limited exceptions for gas up until the end of this calendar year. Secondly, the EU taxonomy, which is not comprehensive or perfect, but which is a very important reference point to assess whether a planned investment is green or not. And there are some other more generic principles like the do no harm principle that could help avoid some of the most problematic spendings. So those two pieces of activity are complementary. They're not the same.
Thank you, Matthias. And I think with that, you, to some extent, answered the question that I would have posed to the group. But I will give Clemens and Juliet one more opportunity to clarify anything that has been stated so far and provide final thoughts. If not, then I believe we will close this webinar. So thank you very much for attending. We hope that we made a convincing argument for this legal analysis, and we hope to welcome you at future webinars. But Nicola, maybe you want to provide a final word.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I think there was a lot of food for thought, and apparently, I don't know, we sometimes had webinars with 40 or 50 questions. This time we did have interesting questions, but a lot less, and I thoroughly understand why, because it really, looking at the few of you who work with state aid on a regular basis, it makes perfect sense to me. So thanks very much also, Andreas, for picking the questions and asking them. You can find the presentation on our website. We posted the URL in the chat, and maybe you can do that once more, Andreas. If you have any remarks, send an email to webinar@agora-energiewende.de. And if you want to be kept up to date on all the latest online events and others, subscribe to our newsletter, which you can find on the website as well. We do have one more webinar this week, which will be on the acceptance of renewable energies. It is in German, so only maybe for the ones speaking German. Other than that, there's nothing planned for the time being for the rest of the month, but you never know. So again, I strongly recommend to subscribe to our newsletter to be kept up to date. The recording, as I mentioned earlier, will be on the website at some stage this week, and I usually do send you an email once it's online, but obviously you can check before if you're curious about it. And yes, have a good rest of the day. Stay healthy, keep the distance, and if you go on holiday, have a good time, enjoy, relax, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.